Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon from Baku. To those of you joining online, as well as everyone in the room, thank you for joining us. Lovely to see familiar faces, friendly faces, everyone smiling. Day two is good, right? Thank you for being here. I'm Shuchi. I'm Shuchi Vora from the Global Resilience Partnership. I'm head of learning at GRP. And I shall be your anchor through this session today. I'm doing a slightly difficult job of stepping in for those who haven't been able to make it here because this was a COP where we had overlapping exercises, the CBD COP just before this, so it's been a little difficult to schedule travel, and that is why I'm here, standing here, filling in for colleagues, but very dear colleagues at that. So lovely to be here. We've also had a bit of a challenge to stream in speakers, so we've not been able to get virtual speakers at this session because of audio issues, and apologies for that. But I shall try and attempt to read a message that Puri, Ashana Puri from Sweat Bio has sent in. She was slated to do the opening, but I shall try and read the message that she sent in. So bear with me as I read this and try to fill in for like really big shoes, but yeah. So we have a wonderful panel today. We have colleagues and friends here who have been engaged in this dialogue process before, so it's going to be engaging. And we've been talking about applying a human rights-based approach to synergistic climate and biodiversity action. I'm sure we're all curious of what they have to say and share their own experience. We're looking forward to the experience that they have to share. We are also waiting for two more speakers, by the way. So looking forward to very engaging and interactive conversations here. But some of the key main messages that came out from the dialogue that was held as communicated by various actors include a call for bold new leadership and action to recognize that a human rights-based approach is not just morally and legally required, but it is also the most effective way to achieve biodiversity and climate goals. It addresses root causes of biodiversity loss and climate change, including extractivism and inequitable economic systems. It ensures intergenerational equity in all actions and decisions. It prioritizes the rights of indigenous people and local communities, including their collective rights alongside individual rights, and supports indigenous and traditional knowledge systems and practices. It fosters multi-actor collaborations and dialogues, building trust and reciprocity in all partnerships. Very clear key messages that came out, and a little bit about the process maybe. So basically this process started by highlighting the present opportunities for the group to strengthen the nexus between biodiversity, climate, and human rights at the policy level. The Paris Agreement and the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, KMGBF, both recognize the importance of respecting and promoting human rights. The KMGBF especially states that the framework, including its vision, mission, goals, and targets, is to be understood, acted upon, implemented, reported, and evaluated consistent with some of the human rights principles, such as respect for indigenous rights, gender equality, intergenerational equity, and it even states that the implementation of the framework should follow a human rights-based approach. However, this HRBA, which is the human rights-based approach, while it is not new in concept, it's not necessarily the most familiar either, especially when many are still grappling with the link between human rights and the environment. So as we have received a lot of questions on what does it exactly mean to adopt an HRBA approach, based on this growing interest, we believe that it is important to consult with diverse actors on what HRBA means to them in their context of work, but also in their lived experiences. What could be the role of a human rights-based approach to biodiversity and climate action? How can we foster a shared vision and define some concrete steps to move forward? And as you can see from the presentations, there has been a number of collaboration related to HRBA. So we started this discussion in different formats. So I'm reading this out, so please pardon the we. I wasn't part of the processes, but this group has been, this lovely group here. Right. So I shall move on with the session now and maybe introduce our lovely panelists here. We first have Cindy. She's from the ICCA Collaborative Consortium. Am I correct there? Yes. Cindy Giulianti, she's the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator for Southeast Asia from the ICCA Consortium. And Cindy, can we request you to get to the mic, please, and share your views and experiences of HRBA to the climate change and biodiversity from the indigenous peoples and local communities? How do these multi-actor dialogues support this process and support this way of implementing HRBA in your experience?
I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We really appreciate the invitation for us. I think I will start to, we begin this conversation by introducing our organizations. So ICCA's consortium, ICCA itself is the abbreviations of indigenous and community conserved territories and areas. So we're basically a consortium, a network in global level, but we also have our network in regional, subnational, and sub-regional and national level. So for more than 2 decades, I think one of our priority work in ICCA consortium is really on documenting indigenous and local community territories, conserved territories and areas. It is basically to capture their traditional knowledge and their contribution for biodiversity and climate action. So from the process of the documentations that we've done for 2 decades, we found so many empirical facts that actually humans are also the part of the ecosystem, that the nature themselves, they cannot be remained in this world without be coexistence with the human being itself, because for such a long time, even those who have relation with the nature itself, in our most of our experience are indigenous peoples and local community in that. And in our empirical situation, I think here I can talk more on our experience in Indonesia, because I'm also from Indonesia and working a lot with many indigenous peoples in Indonesia. We have documented like more than 500,000 area that conserved by indigenous peoples and local community, that right now is very struggle for us to pushing it to be recognized by the government, because the first what I capture is that there's a doctrine or colonialized paradigm saying that the nature should when we protect nature, we should exclude humans, because human and threat for biodiversity conservation itself. But in the other side, the fact that we also found in the grassroots level is that any conservation, nature-based solution, or any kind of protected areas project themselves, it's keep being failure, because in the other way, there are so many challenges that need to face by the government itself or decision makers. Not only about the management of the governance itself, but somehow it's about the money, and the one who can do that voluntarily without being paid is actually indigenous peoples and local community that inhabit their territories of life. And by then it's very tragic to see that now we still struggle to really push to shift the paradigm from this colonialized perspective into the new perspective that actually humans also part of the ecosystem. So that's why we need to also work hand in hand to protect nature and biodiversity and one of our work in Indonesia, for instance, to enabling this process of human rights based approach is by our work in advocate for the new conservation law and the NBSA process. It's really to enabling how actually this law can enable the recognition of indigenous people and local community contributions in protecting nature and biodiversity, and how they can shift the old paradigm of this creating more, in that sense of 30 by 30 target,
Yeah.
enabling, new protected areas. But in the other side, without counting that, it's not only about numbers. It's actually about how counting and taking into account the contribution of all people, especially indigenous people and local communities, as stated in Section C, is whole society and whole government, because we've been evaluating that the old approach in protecting biodiversity uh, is doesn't work. It doesn't work. It keep valor. Even like the IT target 11, most of the country are not achieving the targets. So that's why I think here we need to go beyond what is actually needed the most when we talk about HRBA in the workshop that by Swed Bio holding, and I was there in the Nairobi in the first space. We agreed that it's all about enabling space of dialogue. Actually, we need to like meet each other between people, especially the decision makers, create more dialogues there, and then what is it? Create more dialogues, and to understand that the most important thing from all parties about respecting and recognizing all the people that provide the contributions. Respecting means that it's not only talking about participation, which is so far we know that there are so many uh, tokenistic participation where indigenous people are entitled in their presency, but they are not really become the decision makers. It's all about full and effective participation, that they can be there in person physically, but in the other side they can also be involved in the process of making decision itself, not just in the context of bigger law like like the national law, but it's really even like in the technicality of the process of making process itself. And the second is about the recognition. I think the recognition itself is not only about territorial recognition. It is also, no, we know that it is important to recognize territorial rights, but we have to also see that the territorial rights as a basis of the main priority to recognize, but somehow it also pretty tricky because in our experience in Indonesia, after the recognition, sometimes even those who have power still can exclude people from their territories, you know. So I think it meaning that beyond of such recognition, it's all about respect. It's all about recognizing the consents of the people, and ensuring them and recognize them as the actor who also have the same has the same value, has the same position, has the same power actually with the decision maker to create change. From that process in Nairobi, we agreed that HRBA should not be only entitled as as the approach. Somehow it's a lifestyle. It should be a character of the people itself. It couldn't be only entitled to the government as decision maker, but it's all of the actors, including private sector, including us in indigenous peoples or local community, or people who work like NGO working with the community, because somehow it also is not easily working with the process of talking about rights, because there will be so many alignment with the interests. So that was the analytical process, and so on and so forth. So we need to really be careful on that, but ensure that we need to like move forward beyond this process of negotiation. Is really to working together to have a same perspective about what is exactly rights is all about. I mean, like respecting we can start from something that other people might understand, like the government understand that they might actually started talking about rights, but they don't know and we if we keep resisting that, that might be no time and no space for us to talk each other. So we need, that respect at the first place. Thank you. I think that's for me.
Lovely points. Thank you. Respect is what I'm hearing, and dialogue is what I'm hearing. Thank you so much. We were expecting Tristan Tyrrell, who is the climate change and dry and subhumid lands specialist at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but I don't see Tristan here. So I will probably move to you, Elena, if that's okay. Elisa Morguera is the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change. Elisa, welcome. Question for you. Given your role as a special rapporteur, what do you see are the advantages of HRBA for advancing biodiversity and climate action? What are the instruments and tools out there?
Thank you so much, and it's great to come just after Cindy. I think I want to build on what you said around. Is it coming across clearly? Yeah. What you said about the importance of humans as part of ecosystems. Thank you. So, building on what Cindy was saying about the importance of understanding how humans and cultures are an intrinsic part of ecosystems, and first of all, recognizing how under the Convention on Biological Diversity, all its 196 parties have over time clarified their obligations to support an ecosystem approach where culture, humans, rights, tenure are part and parcel of how we need to proceed in terms of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, as well as bio-based knowledge. And I think this is huge for protecting human rights, including in the context of climate change. Because while we have that recognition, a holistic recognition of everyone's human right to a healthy environment, including children's human rights to a healthy environment, which gives more, I think, legal content to the concept of intergenerational equity, which we do have under the Convention on Biological Diversity. I think that the human rights community still may not have that deep understanding of those the interconnections between human well-being at so many levels, from like bacterial level to planetary level with nature. And so we find that understanding in the ecosystem approach, and I think what we need to foster more and more, and this dialogue has really contributed, is seeing the synergies and the complementarities between the ecosystem approach and the human rights-based approach. Now, on the one hand, I think the ecosystem approach already provides some recognition and protection of human rights, particularly for indigenous peoples and other communities, but it has done so without engaging explicitly with human rights language. And so it is important to recognize that while it offers very pragmatic tools to understand where in decision-making on natural resources, on conservation, those potential areas for protection of human rights arise, it will be helpful now moving forward to be much clearer around legally binding obligations of protection and responsibilities for business enterprises also to respect human rights in that context. At the same time, I think there are other aspects of international human rights law which are crucial in terms of also understanding impacts of climate change that maybe have not yet been spelled out in the ecosystem approach under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So really thinking around racial discrimination, gender-based discrimination, the protection of persons with disabilities, those who find themselves in being forcibly displaced because of climate change. All these considerations have, again, very clear international obligations for states and more clearer responsibilities for business to contribute. And I think we need to connect those understanding of the standards and the evidence arising from human rights in the context of climate change in our application of the ecosystem approach. And maybe the other aspect where I think we are complementing the ecosystem-based approach from an international human rights law perspective is very clear standards about minimal protection of public access to information, public participation in decision making, that standard which we have reiterated many times under the CBD in terms of full and effective participation. Again, we have more detailed standards from an international human rights law perspective, including then access to justice when those rights to information, to participation, to the substantive protection of rights are not fulfilled in the application of the ecosystem approach. And what that means is also that we have a whole new layer of justiciability for our international biodiversity obligations. So there's really a potential for fully realizing that human and nature connections that we already have described and supported under the ecosystem approach with, I think, a broader set of legal standards and legal protections that are available under international human rights law. And then to just round it all up, I think this is what we need in climate change action, where we see climate action that violates human rights. That is often because we have negative impacts on biodiversity, and we need that access to information, the engagement with the lived experiences, genuine participation to make sure that wherever we already have that evidence of negative impacts on biodiversity and human rights, we take that as the center evidence for decision making on climate action. We do not repeat the same mistakes. We prevent what are foreseeable violations. And again, if that is not taken into account, we have the opportunity to raise obligations relating to access to justice and access to appropriate remedies.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Thank you, Elisa. In the meanwhile, we've had Tristan join us. Thank you for joining us. Tristan Tyrrell is, like I had shared before, he is the Climate Change and Dry Subhumid Land Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity at the CBD. Tristan, over to you. I have a question for you here. Could you share your reflections on the HRBA dialogue process at the policy level? That is, what does this mean for the KMGBF Section C and on agenda items around climate change and biodiversity? How did this multi-actor dialogue process support the way forward in an integrated way?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry that I was late, got caught up in another event that ran over, so apologies for that. Yeah, absolutely. So within the CBD, I just caught the very end of Elisa's intervention there. There has been a history of engaging with Indigenous peoples, with local communities, with people more on the ground, and at least recognizing to a certain extent the importance of their practices, their cultures, their knowledge in helping us address biodiversity loss. And that's all very positive. On a sort of a more broad, as a convention, obviously we're looking at it from the top down. It's an international process, it's a global level process, and it's about how that is then interpreted down to the local level. And so yes, there has been a history of recognizing the importance of full and effective participation and engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities. But one of the big challenges is that, as we're seeing with the biodiversity crisis in general, that despite efforts to set global targets, whether it's a general 2010 target of reducing the rate of loss, or more in-depth IEG targets, and now with the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, we're seeing that there is ambition to a certain extent in terms of trying to address the crisis, trying to link it to our economic systems and our social systems, recognizing the links with the interdependence with and interlinkage with these additional and joint crises such as climate change, such as pollution, etc. But the challenge still remains on how do you interpret that down to the local level, because frankly, it's at that level that we actually need to see any sort of change happening, because ultimately biodiversity and certainly the impacts of climate change are being felt and recognized more closely, more clearly at the local level. And so when the KMGBF, the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, was adopted 2 years ago in Montreal. It has within its Section C, which is sort of cross-cutting considerations across the full goals and targets of the framework. It has this recognition of human rights-based approach and the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, which is a fantastic step forward. The challenge is, how do we ensure that parties, given that it is a party-driven process, are effectively recognizing these cross-cutting considerations and translating those into action at the national and in particular at the local levels. And when it comes to HRBA, the human rights-based approach, it's what does that actually mean in the actual context in which these countries, these governments, these parties, and the various actors and stakeholders at the various levels, what does that mean in their particular context? And there is a challenge in that even just mentioning the words human rights automatically got people putting their backs up, and we saw that even just a couple of weeks ago in Cali at our COP16, where within the biodiversity and climate decision, which of course talks about the importance of recognizing the need to build resilience and to take appropriate action to address the impacts of climate change, both for ourselves, for biodiversity, and then of course recognizing how effective conservation, protection and sustainable management can help to help achieve goals even under this process, for instance. The mention of human rights automatically had some parties putting their hands up and saying that they weren't comfortable with that language. And this multi-actor dialogue process has been very valuable in just creating a safe space, or at least trying to create that safe space that even those who might have an issue with discussions around this can at least come to the table and to talk about it in a way that allows them to maybe look at for opportunities on how, hopefully, that they would want to advance some of these issues, but to try and find ways to take this forward, recognizing that there is this dichotomy between duty bearers and rights holders, and recognizing that it's not just quite so black and white, it's not quite so us against them as such, but actually we're all trying to work collectively together to address these existential crises that we are ultimately facing. It is a process, though, and that process needs to continue. It built up to Cali, to COP16, and I think from those what we call Article 8J, the aspects under the convention that specifically talk about Indigenous peoples and local communities, there were some very positive decisions that came out of the COP. There were others that, as you probably know, were not adopted in the end for various reasons. But I think there were some major steps forward in terms of recognizing how important Indigenous peoples and local communities and people of African descent and various important stakeholder groups are, even though we are talking at a global international level, but it's about ensuring, or at least trying to make sure, that parties in their efforts to implement the convention, as well as others, the other governments that aren't party to the convention, the observers and the various stakeholders and actors at all levels have a consistent and coherent perspective on what we should be doing. And the HRBA process is obviously central to that, both in terms of achieving the convention as a whole, but then ultimately to ensure that we are building that resilience to both biodiversity loss and to climate change. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. That's super helpful, I think, to just set context overall for everyone here. Next, we have a video from Bongiwe Simka from ICLE Africa. I'd request the AV team to queue up the video. Unfortunately, we didn't have representation in the first week from ICLE, and which is why we have a video playing here.
Albeit virtually, to share insights on mainstreaming a human rights-based approach within the Urban Natural Assets Project. The UNA program is one of ICLE Africa's flagship programs, made possible through the funding from SweetBio, having seen implementation for 10 years across 10 cities in Africa. Key to the project is working with local and subnational governments in Africa who are experiencing challenges around protecting and revitalizing their urban natural assets through the integration and mainstreaming of nature-based solutions into city planning activities. In line with the growing need to drive equitable development, the current phase of UNA resilience, is anchored on a human rights-based approach, putting people at the center of processes as it relates to nature, climate action, and development. In efforts to mainstream a human rights-based approach in both City Sierra Leone and Cape Coast, Ghana, our two current cities, a key entry point has been the vernacularization of human rights. Leaning on local stories, folklore, and tapping into the community fabric to initiate discussions, connecting the dots between humans, human rights, and the natural environment. Using this as an entry point, vernacularization of human rights has allowed us to unpack the conceptual understanding of human rights, prioritize representation, calling for the intentional inclusion of women, youth, and vulnerable groups in decision-making as it relates to nature-based solutions and climate action. It has allowed us to onboard gender rights, where we ground participants' understanding in gender rights and socio-cultural drivers of gender biases and stereotypes. And lastly, it has allowed us to break down power dynamics, where we prioritize creating a safe environment for inclusive participation. As I conclude this discussion, our experience with mainstreaming a human rights-based approach has taught us that this is a process on not just working with cities to learn about these concepts and frameworks, but to unlearn decades and centuries of sociocultural biases and stereotypes. There is a great hesitation from stakeholders to take on these concepts, right? In most communities, there is the assumption that human rights are detached from many deeply held traditional and customary norms and values. There is resistance from religious beliefs that are resistant to change. And also we see a lot of disassociation of human rights from African cultures and norms. While this is the case, we have seen progressive shifts in the mindsets and people's mindsets over the last 4 years of implementing this approach in UNA. With continuous awareness, capacity development, city stakeholders and communities have progressively taken up these lessons, advocating for better resourcing and gender-responsive decision-making. When we initiated discussions on human rights, we were very intentional about prioritizing representation, right? Ensuring women, youth, traditional leaders, researchers, among others, were in the room, creating an inclusive space for dialogue. What this has done is promote behavioral change at multiple scales. Our cities have since become more intentional about doing the same, including in how they allocate resources to ensure that marginalized groups are deliberately included in local interventions and decision making, a sign of progress. More than anything, our work has amplified the need for intentional and equitable targeting of vulnerable groups by interventions and adopting a whole of society approach to planning for and with nature. To help cities sustain the momentum and drive uptake, a number of tools and resources, including interactive infographics, videos, and publications targeting different audiences, have been developed to share lessons on what has worked in UNA and how to take that forward. In conclusion, to effectively reach the ambitious targets we've set for biodiversity and climate action, our efforts need to be based on a human rights-based approach, ensuring that equity and justice are at the forefront and ultimately leaving no one behind. Thank you for your time. I wish you all an exciting and insightful discussion further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, team. I'll move on to the next speaker, who's the last of our panelists, but by no means least, Maria Cristina Cifuentes. Please excuse me if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but she's from the Colombia Ministry of Environment. She's also the lead negotiator on just transitions. And Maria, I have a question for you. In terms of the work that you do and your responsibility, why is the human rights based approach in biodiversity and climate action important? Why are such collaborations, for example, through this multi actor dialogue, why are these dialogues key to the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So first, I would like to emphasize three main areas where we are interconnecting both agendas, biodiversity and climate action. First, regarding to the peace processes of Colombia with the negotiations of, with the armed groups, armed forces, which is an important issue in our country. Second, with the NDC approach, how we are including the biodiversity and climate action priorities from both conventions with a human rights approach. And third, how we are approaching this in the negotiation of just transition as country. So for the first topic regarding the peace process, we are trying to promote nowadays dialogues with the revolutionary armed forces of Colombia with a transformative approach. And that means that we go to the territories to talk to them, we invite them, but we also invite different stakeholders in order to recognize their priorities and needs. We have had a conflict of more than 60 years, an internal conflict that has been very challenging to implement the climate action and biodiversity agenda, because every time we try to go to the territory, we have these kind of obstacles. So that's why we cannot proceed without having an alternative solution and try to approach them and identify what the priorities are in the territories. Mainly what they have said is that regarding the poverty and development gaps that we have in the country, they do not have alternatives, and especially youth people has been involved. They have been involved with this kind of illicit activities and groups because they have not had many choices. And that's why it's important for us to include everybody, to also promote the intergenerational approach that was mentioned before, in order to analyze what alternatives we are going to provide and try to work on these gaps that we have to avoid conflict in long term. On the second hand, regarding the NDC process, for the updating process of our NDC of Colombia 2025 until 2030, we are promoting some national workshops at territorial level with the subnational governments, I mean mayors and governors of the different departments of Colombia. And the idea is to invite different stakeholders to the workshops, so then the NDC will not be promoted only by the national level sector with the different ministries, but also listening at the local and real priorities at the local level. So in that way, we can promote this human rights approach, including the participatory approach, enhancing not only to invite them to participate in the workshops, but also to make them part of the decision making. And we want to have substantial results on this NDC that is going to have a specific part or area of biodiversity. This is something new also in comparison with the NDC version of 2020. And what we have been promoting is that the sectors, the ministries, could be committed to formulate measures for the new NDCs with financial support in order to see the real actions that they are going to implement to include everybody on the actionable solutions for biodiversity and the climate action agenda. And that means that we have to think in specific different methodologies to approach them. So it's not the same to try to formulate some measures for biodiversity and climate action for indigenous communities than for children, rather for rural communities and so on. So we decided to try to strengthen the methodology, the participatory methodology, in order to hear what are the main priorities and needs for each one of the groups, and try to identify the responsible sectors to implement those measures. And on the third hand, regarding the negotiations of just transition for the current COP29, human rights has been a red line for us. So in the case of Colombia, we won't continue talking about anything without having in the text the guarantee of including the human rights approach and in which manner. So we have had 7 elements of just transition that were adopted last year in the COP28. And one of those 7 elements, which is element F of Decision 3 CMA5, talks about inclusive and participatory approaches to left no one behind. And what does it mean? What does it mean to left no one behind? Because, as I told you, it is not only a fact of including and inviting them, but also empower themselves in order to make them part of the decision-making process. So we are trying to guarantee that there is a very robust paragraph in the text that talks about the different stakeholders that we want to include in the implementation of the Just Transition Work Program. And we are including indigenous communities, children, internally displaced people, rural communities, and so on. So we are trying to clarify, because sometimes when we talk about the whole of society approach, which is super crucial for us, and we totally agree, we need to understand what do we mean by that, right? Because sometimes stakeholders itself, they say, it's obvious that it's everybody. Yeah, it's everybody, but let's think about who is everybody and how we're going to approach them. So when we identify and we divide and specify in that way in the text, which groups are we going to include, then that opens the opportunity in further steps, when we discuss the work plan, try to identify the specific methodology per group. So that's important. And on the second hand, to left no one behind, also we need to identify the different priorities and the stakeholders that we have in the different regions. And as Tristan mentioned, in the COP16 that was Colombia was hosting the COP16 with a special focus on inviting different communities, because this was the COP of people, as we were calling it, that required to listen at the real priorities that they had in their territories and try to involve those priorities in the text. So, as Tristan said, there are many good results from this COP, many other things to continue pushing, but I think that with the interconnection of both conventions, we could have a progress not only through the COP16 and COP29, but also regarding the COP30 that is going to come. For now, this COP is crucial because this is the finance COP, and without a means of implementation and without finance, we could write whatever we want in the text, but at the end we will have the way to implement it, right? So we are trying not to leave the finance issue only for NCQG, but bringing this issue also to our items of negotiation, because that's the way we can push forward for to implement the Just Transition Work Program.
Thank you so much. I think, Elisa, you need to leave, and we're very sorry to lose you to this panel. But thank you so much for joining us. It was lovely to have you. But for the rest of the panelists, we do want to open up the floor for questions to the audience. In case there are any questions for Tristan, Cindy, or Maria Cristina.
Thank you. I'm Christina Cook. I'm a Mayak Ekchi woman from Belize, Central America, and I work with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. I think one of the issues that I did not, that was not overly emphasized and something that we work really focused on is the fact that as we expand these conservation areas, as we look at the targets, as we aim for those goals, with respect to climate action, the reality is that this is expanding into Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And one of the fundamental issues of human rights that we focus on is the criminalization of Indigenous human rights defenders. I mean, all around the world, the data shows predominantly how these expansions, these climate actions are actually amounting to increased violence and conflict among Indigenous peoples. And the reality is that these are the people that are protecting the lands and forests. 20% of our customary lands, for instance, 20% of the land surface are customary lands of Indigenous peoples. And so I think that's really important to consider as we consider emphasizing a human rights approach. Another very important issue for us is to emphasize as well, as you spoke about, some of you spoke about, the distinct connection that indigenous peoples have with nature, but also their distinct rights to lands and territories. I think that's really important because when we get put into everybody, we become nobody. And the invisibility of indigenous peoples is really something that we've been fighting against. In my country where I come from, for instance, our governments always say Belize is for all Belizeans. But the reality is that indigenous peoples in Belize are not even seen as Belizeans. And so that is something that I want to emphasize.
May I interrupt? I'm sorry. We are short of time. I respect your
that's
views.
fine. That's fine.
Lovely
Thank you.
views. Thank you so much. But it would be great to give, maybe the person next to you has something to share, and then maybe the panelists can come in and respond very briefly. We have 5 minutes now. Please keep your question to one line.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the panel. If I could ask you just to say a bit about where you see the legally binding agreements, particularly regarding business and business's role in the transition, as was described by Elisa before in her speech. But just to say a bit more about the business and human rights angles to this. Sorry, I'm Phil Bloomer from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre.
Thank you so much. Maybe we answer the second question first. The first one was more of a comment. Thank you for that. We answer the second question, and I don't know, is it Tristan or Maria Cristina who wants to take this question?
Sorry. In our case, we had a previous consultation with the private sector because actually business is one of the main concerns for the current agenda. So what we did 2 months ago was to have a high-level consultation with them in order to see how we're going to approach the business area as an enabling condition and the diversification of the economy. Every time we try to promote a climate action or biodiversity protection agenda, we need to think about what are the response measures for it. So sometimes when we try to promote a very good alternative, there are some consequences that are not good for everybody, and that has an impact on business. So if we want to create a real effective economic transition, we need to also help and provide more support for the private sector. So some of them have more advantages in comparison with others. So some of them have more financial basis, but some others were saying we need more financial support in order to help you, government, to fulfill the agenda of providing the protection for the workforce who is going to transit. If we want to provide more business alternatives, we need more financial support. So they were talking about that. And on the second hand, we said that the capacity building is very key in this process for strengthening the business agenda and in the interconnection with this. But not only capacity building itself, because we were saying if we are going to do a reskilling process, for example, for the workforce, we need to think about all the other gaps or obstacles that we could have if we want to implement a real, very good or effective reskilling process. Just to say an example, if we want to do a reskilling program with a rural area or community, maybe they may have some obstacles in terms of transportation, gender gaps, and some other obstacles that we need to consider every time we want to promote a business strategy with them. So that's important to see this in a holistic and systemic approach.
Thank you so much. We have a minute, and which is why I'll take the floor and thank you all for joining us online as well as in person. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for bearing with me with reading out my questions and being shaky about it. But it's been lovely to hear from you. I have learned a lot. I hope everyone who's listening to this has learned a lot. And I hope this dialogue is as useful to this cause as it has the potential to be. So thank you so much. And please continue the conversation. So thank you.